Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 8 of the Introduction to Buddhism. This week is on work and life. So let me just put up the outline. So our question today is, what does it mean to be a Buddhist in everyday life? And how can we use our work, our relationships, and our life as a path? So we'll start by talking about what does it actually mean to do good? And how can we think about Buddhist ethics and how to live that in our lives? After the break, we'll talk about what does it mean to use life as a path, and what is a path, and how do we use our life that way? And then we'll talk about integrity, right? The importance of vows and commitments, and also what we can do when we break those commitments. All right. So I know in previous weeks we've talked about making anything into a Buddhist practice through the practice of good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end. So I'd like to propose for all of us, just take a moment to collect your intention for how you'd like to approach being part of this teaching here today. How can you use it as part of your own Buddhist path, your own Buddhist practice, your own aspiration to be of benefit to all beings? I'll let you just gather that for a moment. Okay, so in previous weeks we talked a lot about the view about non-duality as the basis for the Mahayana Buddhist path. Ultimately, no phenomena have a true existence, including, of course, the self, but relatively they appear like dreams or illusions. In other words, there is no basis for clinging. It's all just a mistake. It's all ignorance. But on its own, this might lead people to become nihilist, uncaring, treat the world as if nothing matters, which of course is an extreme view, right? It's not the non-dual view. So to counter this, we have this famous saying from Guru Rinpoche Padmasambhava, who's famous for bringing Buddhism to Tibet. And his saying is, though your view should be vast as the sky, keep your conduct as fine as flower. And conduct we can also translate as action or attention to the laws of cause and effect and so forth. In other words, just because phenomena don't truly exist doesn't mean they don't appear, doesn't mean they don't function, right? There's still interdependence arising and ceasing in the world. And even though we can call this world illusory, our experiences feel very real, right, to sentient beings like us. It's no surprise Descartes concluded, cogito ergo sum. So as compassionate bodhisattvas, we care about the experience of sentient beings, even if they're illusions founded on ignorance. We care about people's experience in the world. So another way of saying this is to say we wish to be in the world, but not of the world, right? We want to be able relatively to function, to care, to be of benefit in the world, but not of the world, right? We don't want to have clinging or attachment or hope or fear. We don't want pride or a sense of accomplishment if things work, or a sense of disappointment if things don't work. And we need both of these two truths for our practice to be an authentic Dharma practice. As we said last week with Bhikkhu Bodhi, in the proper practice of the Dharma, both principles, that of self-transformation and of self-transcendence, are equally crucial. The principle of self-transformation alone is blind, leading at best to an ennobled personality, but not a liberated one. The principle of self-transcendence alone is barren, leading to a cold, ascetic withdrawal devoid of the potential for enlightenment. Okay, so what does it mean when we say our action should be fine as flower? So the Tibetan master Tulku again, he said, quoting on the Guru Rinpoche quote again, though the view should be vast as the sky, keep your conduct fine as barley flour, but don't confuse one with the other. When training in the view, you can be as unbiased, as impartial, as vast, immense, and unlimited as the sky. Your behavior, on the other hand, should be as careful as possible in discriminating what is beneficial or harmful, what is good or evil. One can combine the view and conduct, but don't mix them or lose one in the other. This is very important. View like the sky means that nothing is held onto in any way whatsoever. You're not stuck anywhere at all. In other words, there is no discrimination as to what to accept and what to reject. No line is drawn separating one thing from another. But conduct as fine as barley flour means there is good and evil, and one needs to differentiate between the two. Give up negative deeds. Practice the Dharma. In your behavior, in your conduct, it is necessary to accept and reject. In other words, in our worldly life, in our practice, in our conduct, in our work, in our relationships, there is still this sense of dualism, this sense of right and wrong, certainly for beginners like us who don't yet understand spontaneous action. And I think this is a big source of misunderstanding and potential in contemporary mindfulness, because we have John Kabat-Zinn's definition of mindfulness as the awareness that arises from paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally. And I think a lot of people, unfortunately, interpret non-judgmental to mean we cannot apply any moral or ethical thinking in our practice. They seem to think we're supposed to somehow inhabit a heavenly realm where everything is good all of the time. But of course, it goes without saying our practice cannot progress with that kind of attitude. Tulku Ugyen continues, you need to give up negative actions. You need to apply the Dharma. So it's impossible to practice the Dharma in one's life without hope and fear, without accepting and rejecting. It is only in terms of the view that there is nothing to accept or reject through hope or fear. Both hope and fear are thoughts. The view is free of these, but the conduct is not. As we become Dharma practitioners, we need to accept what should be adopted, which is the path of Dharma, reject what should be left behind, which is the mundane patterns of life. One surely needs to accept and reject, and that is based on hope and fear. There's nothing wrong with that. It is in the view there should be no accepting and no rejecting. Okay, so as we saw in week 2, we can simplify the whole of the Buddhist path into do no harm, do good, and train your mind. From the Dhammapada, the quote was, doing no evil, engaging in what is skillful and purifying one's mind. This is the teaching of the Buddhas. And this is all very well and makes sense. However, the next natural question is, okay, we want to do good, but how are we to determine what is good? We need some kind of yardstick, some kind of metric, some way to make choices. And we saw last week that the Buddha cautioned us not to speculate about ultimate origins. As you may recall the story of the prince who wouldn't have a poisoned arrow removed until he knew who had shot the arrow, with what kind of bow, what kind of materials, and so forth. We also learned not to speculate about the ultimate consequences of action, as in the story of the Chinese farmer, because what might seem bad in the short term could be good in the long term, and vice versa. And indeed, even when we know the science, which usually we don't, we can't predict what's going to happen more broadly in society. So look at COVID as an example. Not just the fact that the virus itself is evolving all the time, but just look at the response that we've seen in society with masks and vaccination and the politicization and division. Even now, it's very unclear what the coming winter will hold. So if you're trying to make policy for COVID, it's very unclear what is good, what is bad, what is really going to be helpful. But I don't want to kind of overcomplicate it because, despite this ultimate unknowability, we still have an everyday common sense view based on our education and our life experience of how to do things well and how to do things badly, how to treat people well, how to treat people badly. We can differentiate between good and bad food, or a well-played or poorly played piece of music, or a successful surgery compared to one that causes damage and leaves the patient needing additional operations. We know when someone's being kind or unkind. And likewise, in general, we can speak about killing and stealing and lying as being bad things. So, we use these generalizations to navigate our world, But things can quickly become more complicated because there is rarely a single right answer or shared interpretation. What's more important? A woman's right to choose or protecting an unborn child? How much lockdown is acceptable to control COVID? How many COVID related deaths are acceptable? What if I love my partner but I'm no longer attracted to them? Should I tell them? Or for us as practitioners, and these are some questions that Rinpoche was asked recently, I'm working so hard, I have so little free time. How much do I need to practice? Or I want to do a long retreat, but I'm really worried it'll damage my career prospects. What should I do? Or I'm gay, but I haven't told my parents, who have very traditional Asian values. What should I do? So even if we have the bodhisattva intention, we are cultivating this intention to benefit all beings, even to the point of their enlightenment, it may still not be clear to us how to ensure that our conduct is as fine as flour. We want clear answers, but there aren't necessarily clear answers to be found. And Rinpoche has often said it would be much easier if Buddhism had some clear instructions like pray facing Bodh Gaya 5 times a day, or make a pilgrimage to Bodh Gaya at least once in your life. But Buddhism doesn't have anything like that. And I think it's at this point that the connection between view, meditation, and action breaks down for many people. We've done our meditation practice. We've been cultivating some awareness of the view of the 3 marks and so forth. We want to live in the world as good Buddhists, but it's so unclear how we should do that, how we should act. Right, so that's our topic today. So I just want to spend a little more on non-attachment. So we say view as vast as the sky, and that's about realizing that things do not exist truly in the way that we perceive them. In the Theravada, we talk about anatta and non-self. In the Mahayana, we talk about shunyata or emptiness. And we saw that all phenomena are empty, including emptiness itself, which led us to non-duality. So there, the vast view is about seeing the illusory, dreamlike nature of the self and of all phenomena. And in the Vajrayana, one can go even further to this idea of pure perception and sacred outlook. So what are the practical implications of all of this? Well, if everything has no self, if it all is merely appearing like a dream or an illusion, we can practice non-attachment, and specifically non-attachment to ego. And as a start, we can practice loosening our attachment to the 8 worldly dharmas. And we've already come across rule number 6 in week 3, don't take yourself so goddamn seriously. And Rinpoche gave a nice teaching on the 8 worldly dharmas in 1996. He said, like the Guru Yoga in the Vajrayana teaching, the Lojong or mind training is the essential teaching of all the Mahayana and Theravada paths. Without this, there is no ground, because without Lojong, one does not see the futile aspect of samsara. And until we see the futile aspect of samsara, we will remain victims of the 8 worldly dharmas. And if you are a victim of the 8 worldly dharmas, you are a weak person. So these 8 worldly dharmas, they are wanting to gain, not wanting to lose, wanting pleasure, not wanting pain, wanting fame or looking good, not wanting disgrace or looking bad, wanting praise and not wanting to be despised. And these 8 worldly dharmas are like the armor for the ego. Ego obviously wishes the first set of 4 and doesn't wish the other 4. And from time to time, it's important for us to check whether we are, at this very moment, victims of one or all of these 8 worldly dharmas. And Rinpoche said, when I check myself, I'm very much a victim of all of them. For example, if you want to receive some exotic, high-class Vajrayana teachings, all you have to do is praise me. Of all the 8, I think this is the biggest problem for me. So we must check repeatedly whether we have fallen into this trap, because when a person is the victim of these 8 worldly dharmas, they lose genuineness. For example, because of my position, he said, I'm always living a very pretentious life. I don't have the shame and embarrassment I should have. Every move that I make, even blowing my nose, is an act to draw attention to myself. And he told a lovely story about what he did in London. He said, when I was last in London, I wanted to check myself. So I went to Soho, which is a red light district in London, and I came across a young man who was distributing leaflets in the street. These leaflets were for prostitutes, telephone sex, and all that. And then I thought, well, I should try this. So I went to him and asked if I could distribute them for him. He was surprised at first, and he looked at me for a while. But then he said if I really wanted to, of course I could. He became very happy and left. So then I started to distribute them. But every time I saw someone Japanese or Chinese who resembled a Tibetan, I hoped they were not Tibetan. I was so worried they might ask me, Rinpoche, in what act for the benefit of sentient beings are you engaged? Also, some people started asking me questions once they read the leaflet, such as, what should they do next? I did not know anything and just said, well, everything's written down there. There was a garbage bin nearby, and many times I was so tempted to throw all the leaflets in there, but I did not do it, and I managed to distribute them all. So he said, until we have a good lojong, our emotions will be very rigid. And until our emotions are flexible, or at least soft, the non-dual view might enter our intellectual heads a little bit, but it will not sink into our hearts. Our emotions won't accept that things do not truly exist. So I think another way of thinking about, the view as vast of the sky, non-attachment, is just to notice how much our hope and our fear and our ego clinging manifest in the idea of a dream life. And I don't mean dream as in the shunyata, that all appearances are dreams and illusions. Rather, the dreams of hoping for or thinking you might have found a dream job, a dream relationship, a dream home, and so on. Because immediately we fall into hope and fear, idealism, attachment, and of course the inevitability of disappointment. Because we know everything is marked by the characteristic of dukkha, unsatisfactoriness. Nothing brings ultimate lasting happiness. But the answer is not to live some dull, grey life where we're not allowed to dream. Not at all. We can and we should dream. Dreams can be fun and inspiring and beautiful, but we mustn't think they're real. Right? And this is where I think a lot of people go wrong, because they become anti-love, anti-romance, anti-dreams, anti-passion, indeed anti-life. But that isn't freedom. Yeah? A person who loves to drink and a person who detests alcohol are both caught in their relationship to alcohol. Neither of them is free. Rinpoche gave another example that some people love fashion brands like Gucci and think these things are amazing. Others detest what they see as conformity and status seeking and would rather rebel against it, wearing traditional Chinese dress like a qipao. So, the problem isn't the dreaming, the problem is attachment. We don't want or need to get rid of phenomena. That's just denial and nihilism. We only want to get rid of our attachment. Yeah? And just like dreams, our life is not the problem. Attachment is the problem. The answer is not to stop living, but to stop getting caught in life. And I think the problem for many of us is we don't understand how not to be attached. And especially we confuse attachment with caring, especially because our Western ideas of love and romance are so based on attachment. Yeah, so it's a very common mistake on the path to withdraw and become cold and unemotional and uncaring because we mistakenly think this is what non-attachment looks like. But no, that's just another extreme view. Okay, so what does it mean to care, to do good? So here we come to our action being fine as flour. So yes, the world is complicated, but I really think if we all did our imperfect best, it would work out well. But the problem is we don't, right? We have self-deception, and there's all kinds of incentives in the system to not do the right thing. As Upton Sinclair said, it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. Our economic and legal systems have so many unpriced externalities, pollution, CO2 emissions, damages from climate change, ecosystem destruction, supply chains and communities that they destroy. We have legal frameworks that don't hold people accountable. We have pressures in the capital markets to maximize short-term profits. And many politicians and business leaders are well aware of this, but they can't admit it, otherwise they'll lose their position to someone more ruthless and less scrupulous. Yes, we can say Wall Street is marked by greed, but they're doing whatever they can within the limits of the law. And they know that if their returns on investment are less than their competitors, we're just going to move our money to where we get the best returns. Now, it's a topic for another time, but I find it very interesting how many people who say they care passionately about the environment or social justice are unwilling to accept a lower return on their investments or their pension fund, or they're unwilling to accept products with lower performance or higher cost, even if it were to give them better social or environmental performance. Yeah, and I think similarly in personal morality, we generally know what's right and what's wrong. The problem isn't that we don't know what to do because we lack some ultimate knowledge of consequences, but rather it's self-deception. We know what to do, but we choose not to. Okay, so I want to give an example. This is from a lovely book from the Urbanshaw Institute called Leadership and Self-Deception. So it's about a man telling a story from a few years back about his wife and their newborn. He said, one night a number of years ago, when my son David was just an infant, I was awakened by his wailing cries. He was probably 4 months old or so at the time, and I remember glancing at the clock, and it was around 1 in the morning. I had a busy day at work the next day with some very important meetings. But in the flash of that moment, I had an impression, or a sense, or a feeling, a thought that there's something I should do. It was this: get up and tend to David so that my wife Nancy can sleep. If you think about it, this sort of sense is very basic. We're all people, and when we see others as people, we have a very basic sense about others also, namely that, like us, they also have hopes and needs and cares and fears. And at various times, as a result of this sense, we have impressions of things to do for others, things we think might help them, things we can do for them, things we want to do for them. And this was such an occasion. I felt a desire to do something for Nancy. But you know what? I didn't act on it. I just stayed in bed, listening to David wail. You might say I betrayed my sense of what I should do for Nancy. That's sort of a strong way to say it, but I just mean that in acting contrary to my sense of what was appropriate, I betrayed my own sense of how I should be towards another person. And we could call that self-betrayal. And that's one of the most common things in the world. Now, think of a time when someone was running for the elevator and you could have held open the door for them, but you chose not to, and your last sight of them was the disappointment on their face as the elevator doors closed. Or when you felt you should do something to help your child or your spouse, but then decided not to. Or a time when you felt you should apologize to someone, but never got around to doing it. Or a time when you knew you had some information that would be helpful to a coworker, but you kept it to yourself. Or a time when you knew you needed to stay late to finish some work for someone, but went home instead, without bothering to tell that person. These are all examples of self-betrayal, times when we have a sense of something we should be doing for others, but we don't do it. Okay, so let's go back to the crying baby. Picture that moment. I felt I should get up so that Nancy could sleep, but then I didn't do it. I just stayed lying there next to Nancy, who was also just lying there. Now, in this moment, as I'm lying there listening to our wailing child, what do you imagine I might have started to see and feel about Nancy? How would I make sense of the situation I found myself in? Well, maybe because I'm, sitting there hearing this child and I'm starting to think, maybe she's being a little bit lazy here. After all, she's a full-time mother. It's her job to care for the baby, while I'm trying to work hard to support her family. And now maybe I start to think, well, she's actually a little inconsiderate. Maybe she's even unappreciative of all that I do, insensitive. I might even start to wonder if she's actually really sleeping or just faking it. And so, having betrayed myself, I might start to see my wife in that moment as lazy, inconsiderate, taking me for granted, insensitive, a faker, a lousy mum, a lousy wife. And now I probably also start to see myself as a victim, the poor guy who just couldn't get the sleep he needed, the good husband working hard to provide for his family and just not getting the support he needs. So just notice the dynamic. Yeah, I am the one who sees the situation. I am the one who actually makes the initial choice. But then I rearrange my thoughts, my emotions, my stories about the rest of the world to support and justify my choice. And all this is happening below the threshold of my conscious awareness. This is how self-deception works. So this is why having some kind of ethical guidelines can really help. We've said so many times, being honest with ourselves is the hardest thing. Yeah, so we need and we can benefit from some sort of support to keep us honest on our egoic tendencies or be self-deception. And so this then leads us to Buddhist ethics. And just starting with the idea of morality, right? It comes from the Latin moralitas, which means manner, character, or proper behavior. And it differentiates intentions, decisions, and actions between those that are distinguished as proper, or right, from those that are improper, or wrong. Morality can be a body of standards or principles derived from a code of conduct from philosophy or religion or culture, or it could be from personal lessons that a person believes should be universal. And it can also be synonymous with goodness or rightness. Ethics, also known as moral philosophy, is the branch of philosophy which addresses questions of morality. And the word ethics. See if that helps. The word ethics is commonly used interchangeably with morality, and sometimes used more narrowly to mean the moral principles of a particular tradition or group individual. Excuse me. So this hopefully gets better. I'm so sorry, I don't know what is happening in the sound. For Buddhist ethics, we talk in terms of Shila, right? And it's normally thought of in terms of the enlightenment perspective of Buddha or other such enlightened Bodhisattvas. And Shila is one of the three sections of the Noble Eightfold Path, along with Samadhi, which is meditation, and Prajna, which is wisdom. It's also the second of the six paramitas in the Mahayana. Oh, anyone, if you could make a note in the chat, is it actually getting better? Is it helping? I'm so sorry, I don't know what it is. Okay, what I can do is I can try and change my microphone. Excuse me. Okay, can you hear me now? Let's just try this, see if this is any better. Okay, good. All right, that seems to be working. Apologies again, I don't know what that is. All right, so what is Shila in Buddhism? It's a code of conduct that's a commitment to harmony and self-restraint, with the principal idea being non-violence or freedom from causing harm. It's also sometimes called virtue or moral discipline. Now, it's an internal, aware, and intentional ethical behavior according to one's commitment to the path of liberation, right? And it's an ethical compass, right? It's internal rather than what's more typically associated with the English word morality in the sense of obedience or obligation to external constraints. And in the Theravada, there are two aspects. There's the things that we do, the right performance, the carita, and the right avoidance, the varita. And honoring Shila is considered a great gift to others because it creates an atmosphere of trust and respect and security. It means, as a practitioner, we pose no threat to another person's life, property, family, rights, or well-being. Yeah, Rinpoche often quotes Milarepa saying, "My practice is not deceiving myself and not disturbing others." Yeah, so this idea of not disturbing others is a very big part of our practice. And for lay people, we have the 5 precepts, right, which we'll typically commit to when we go to take refuge. And this is abstaining from 5 things, right? So not killing, not taking life, not stealing, not taking what's not given, no sexual misconduct, which put simply refers to adultery, no false speech or lying, and no intoxicants, right? So liquors, wines, and so forth, which are the basis for heedlessness and carelessness. And they're not commandments, but they're rather a set of voluntary commitments or guidelines to help one live a life in which one is happy, without worries, and able to practice. They're supposed to prevent suffering and weaken our likelihood to fall into greed and hatred and delusion. And notice that these 5 precepts are primarily behavioral and relatively black and white, cut and dried, right? They're easy in the sense they may not be easy to follow, but they're relatively easy to understand what we're committing to. Now, another way of talking about Buddhist ethics is the 10 wholesome actions, also called the 10 good actions or the 10 skilled karma paths, right? Divided into 3 bodily actions, 4 verbal actions, and 3 mental actions, right? All of which are said to cause unskillful qualities to decline while skillful qualities to grow. These are mostly likewise framed as giving up various bad habits, the assumption being that I guess a lot of our ordinary worldly habits are not necessarily good ones. So the bodily actions, giving up killing or violence, giving up stealing, giving up sexual misconduct, so again, part of the 5 precepts the same. The verbal actions, giving up lying, giving up divisive speech, right? So don't seek to divide people against each other. Instead, aim to reconcile those who are divided, supporting unity, delighting in harmony, loving harmony, speaking words that promote harmony. Right? In particular, this tends to include no gossip, right? Because that's usually in the spirit of being divisive. Another one is give up harsh speech, right? So speak in a way that's mellow, pleasing to the ear, lovely, going to the heart, polite, likable, and agreeable. Yeah, so you can see there that no sort of aggression, non-violence, avoiding criticism, contempt, and so forth. The next one is giving up talking nonsense, right? So we speak words that are timely and true and meaningful and useful, right? In line with the teachings, not just kind of random nonsense. And now it's interesting because if you look at our contemporary world, right, so much of what we do in relationships, in organizations, on social media, is communication. Yeah, so these 4, if we were to practice that, I think would have a huge difference in our world. And this idea of like being open, being transparent, not lying, but then being accepting, non-critical, no harsh or divisive speech, I think just thinking of it like that, that really is what taking accountability for one's words can start to look like. We'll come back to this. The mental actions, they're no envy, right? So not coveting the wealth or belonging of others, instead having a kind heart and loving intentions. The next one is being kind and being loving. And finally, belief in karma and the consequences of action. In other words, not being nihilistic. So, understanding that our actions have fruits and consequences and so forth. So this list is already a very practical list and will make a huge difference if we put it into practice. Recently, a friend of mine was working with her colleagues just on this practice of no harsh or no divisive speech. And they practiced that in their team for a couple of months. And she told me it's been really transformational for them, right? Just that one thing has made such a difference to the way they interact and the level of trust on their team. So it may seem very small, very simple, but if we're consistent in our practice, in our conduct in the world, it can make a huge difference. And going back to the example of the husband who chooses not to take care of the crying child in the middle of the night, we can see that if he were to put these 10 wholesome actions into practice, it could really offer some kind of insurance policy against his self-deception. And so staying with relationships for a moment, I want to turn to the work of John Gottman, who's a famous psychologist and marriage therapist. I mean, he was featured in Malcolm Gladwell's book Blink, because he was famous in being able to watch a couple in conversation for just 15 minutes and predict with greater than 90% accuracy about whether they were going to stay married or end up getting divorced. And so how did he do this? Well, it turned out he was looking for four very specific kinds of behaviors, right? So back to verbal actions. And it turns out these four are predictive of whether or not people are going to get divorced, right? The first one is criticism, an attack on a person's personality or character, right? As opposed to a complaint, right? With something where you just don't like. And typically differentiate by how you start a conversation. You know, are you starting out respectfully or making broad statements like you always or you never and so forth? Next is defensiveness, which is often a response to criticism. When you victimize yourself to ward off a perceived attack, you don't take accountability, and often you reverse the blame onto your partner, saying things like, well, of course I do this because of what you do. Right? The next one is actually the most dangerous, the worst, the most predictive of divorce, and that's contempt. And that's when you're attacking the other person's character from a position of moral superiority. Right? You no longer respect them, so you may be sarcastic or cynical or name-calling or mocking or using hostile humor. And the final one is stonewalling, right? It's when communication is completely broken down. There's withdrawal, shutting down, mental and physical barriers to convey disapproval, avoid interaction. And all of those together, as I say, you can see very quickly whether we fall into them in our behaviors. Right, and of course, especially with contempt, the number one predictor of divorce, it goes without saying that in that situation, the person's view of their partner is not even common humanity, right? We don't even see them as an equal, let alone seeing their Buddha nature. So, what would we do? Well, the Dharma antidote is pretty straightforward, right? We cultivate the four immeasurables as our aspiration. We really practice loving kindness and compassion. We wish that for our partner. And then we cultivate these 10 wholesome actions. And in particular, we give up harsh speech and divisive speech. As Rinpoche often says, yes, as aspiring bodhisattvas, we should cultivate the wish to liberate all sentient beings, but it's good to start with just one person that's close to you. And maybe we don't even have to start with the aspiration of their enlightenment, although of course that's the best. Maybe we can start with a more simple worldly aim of just maintaining a harmonious relationship. You might say this doesn't seem like very much, maybe it's too simple, but something like 5 out of 10 marriages end in divorce. And of the remainder, 3 out of 10 stay together but not at all happy. It's really only about 2 out of 10 marriages that are what we might term happy marriages. And the numbers are very similar to other long-term committed relationships that aren't actual marriages. Likewise, the quality of relationships between parents and children, or between siblings, or between family members, we can very much see these four horsemen, right? We can see the extent to which criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling come up in our relationships. And likewise at work, right? We know most people are not engaged in their workplaces. And we say an employee is engaged when they're enthusiastic about their work and they take a positive action towards furthering the organization's reputation and interests. They value the organization's values. Whereas disengaged may range from somebody doing the bare minimum, sort of coasting at work, even down to people who are actively disengaged and damaging a company's output and reputation. Now, the company Gallup has collected this data for many years, and consistently over the past 20 or 30 years, they find that only about a third of employees are highly engaged at work. Roughly a half have pretty low levels of engagement, and 1 in 6 are actively disengaged. Right? When you've had that experience of trying to call up the helpline or the customer service and you find this person who seems to just want to let you know what a bad day they're having, that's what that feels like, right? So it turns out whether we're at work or whether we're in relationships, these numbers are fairly similar. Most people are pretty unhappy, it seems, right? Now, with companies, of course, engagement, as you can imagine, really drives an organization's performance. So there's a lot of incentives to improve things. companies do everything from creating beautiful office environments to giving perks like free gourmet lunches or luxurious on-site gyms, even meditation studios. But if you look at what drives a person's engagement, over 70% is driven by their relationship with their direct manager. Yeah, and much of the rest is with their colleagues. So, yes, admittedly, the corporate context is more complicated than a marriage because there is a power relationship and a goal-setting relationship where the manager gets to define what the employee should do. But, actually in many marriages, especially more traditional ones, there's also a power relationship, there's also inequality. And, of course, in the workplace, our conflicts tend to be more below the surface. We don't tend to see many shouting matches in the office. But, unsurprisingly, if a manager-employee relationship or relationships with our colleagues are marked by criticism or defensiveness, then just as with a marriage, it isn't going to end well. So what can we learn from this? Well, back to the Buddha's words, do no harm, do good, train your mind. Of course, we should aim to do good and to train our minds. We should aim to liberate all sentient beings. But if we could just start by focusing on doing no harm in our immediate relationships, in our personal, our work lives, that alone would make a huge difference. As we said, just cultivating the 4 immeasurables, loving kindness, compassion, just cultivating the 10 wholesome actions, even just giving up harsh speech and divisive speech. Doing no harm doesn't require big or expensive gifts, doesn't even require a lot of time. It just requires us to pay attention to our intention and our conduct. Of course, yes, as Rinpoche says, if we can remember the view, it's always going to be our foundation. It's always going to serve us well. But many of us are not yet familiar or habituated enough with the view of anatta or shunyata. Maybe we can't bring it to the foreground of our awareness when we're in the middle of a conflict with our partner. Maybe we don't know yet how to see that conflict as like a dream or like an illusion. And so at those times, just relying on, just reminding ourselves to do no harm, that can be so helpful. I also want to say, just in this context of Buddhist ethics, Rinpoche has been talking a lot over the past few years about this notion of not getting overly caught up in sort of strict ethical kind of prescriptions. I think he's a little concerned that some teachers are being very strict in interpreting things like, no alcohol, no sex, and so forth, in a way that is turning ordinary people away from Buddhism. Right? They start to think it's religious, it's restrictive, it's no fun, it's anti-life, anti-world, and so forth. So always remember, our most foundational practice is wisdom rather than good behavior per se. Right? Of course, we're not excusing bad behaviors, but just to remember the path is intended to train us in wisdom. So yes, at the beginning, it may be appropriate to be a little more lenient regarding behaviors, because as long as somebody is practicing, we can trust that the path will transform them and in time transform their desire to engage in unhelpful behaviors. Yes? So just as Rinpoche will forgive seemingly religious attitudes because he'll know they will fall away or evaporate like a morning mist if we just do our practice. By definition, we're all imperfect as we start out on the path. So the point is not to demand a kind of ethical perfection, but rather it's encouraging practice, right? And practice not just of ethics, but the balance of wisdom, compassion and ethics, and mindfulness all together. Right? That is what constitutes progress. Remember, even Shantideva said, yes, for now we're entitled even to the idea of enlightenment, even though ultimately that too is a wrong view. Yeah, but for beginners like us, we need that kind of inspiration. Okay, so I want to talk a little about also the middle way and not falling into extremes. Rinpoche gave a nice example of what he called elegance and outrageousness, right? This idea of the elegance of fitting in versus the outrageousness of being willing to stand outside conventional norms. Now, most of us have a tendency to prefer one or the other of these. And so we can fall into extremes. And as a reminder, right, we're trying to practice non-duality here. We're trying not to fall into extremes, even one as seemingly commonplace as, fitting into society. So this is from a teaching on Bodhicharyavatara he gave in Berlin in 1990. He said, many people think outrageousness means being free, being able to express one's own emotions. They cry, they shout, they scream. They think it's having a confident personality, like dyeing your hair or cutting it in a different style, walking in the street in a funny dress. They think that's what being outrageous is about. But that's not outrageousness. That's just another way of being a punk or a yuppie. So to be more precise, outrageousness means to do things genuinely and not to be the slave of society. Now, wearing a tie is not so important for being elegant, but society has determined that elegant people should wear ties, and we have become slaves of that. We have to buy a tie, we have to learn how to wear it properly. We have to understand the difference between good and bad manners. But we need to know when to step beyond custom and manners. Now, even in our Dharma practice, outrageousness is so important. It's almost like the display of bravery and courage. How we make offerings, how we visualize. Because normally we come to our practice with such a poverty mentality. We tend to think there's just one right way to do it. And Rinpoche always encourages us not to be limited, not to sort of get stuck within our narrow cultural confines, and think in a much more expansive way of how to practice. And so this really applies as we think about how to bring our Dharma into our work and our relationships. Right? This idea of really outrageousness, being genuine, not being the slave of whatever tribe or group or society we're part of. And for those of us who have the tendency to want to rebel, we might think that elegance is somehow contradictory to outrageousness. But actually, a practitioner must also be elegant. Right? The way she walks, the way she sits, the way she dresses, the way she flips the pages of her sadhana, the way she beads her mala, the way she does her meditation. Elegance is so important. In order to be elegant, maybe you have to wear that tie which you rejected earlier. The idea of elegance is creating an atmosphere in everything, in Dharma practice and in life. Atmosphere is so important. If you create the atmosphere well, then Dharma practice also becomes good. It's like when you go to a special occasion as everyone's wearing a nice dress. It doesn't necessarily mean your mind becomes sharper, but somehow, because of the atmosphere, it helps. When you go to a Dharma center and you're wearing a floppy dress and you sit on a floppy cushion, we could say the situation is very relaxed, but we could also say it's very clumsy. And then your concentration and everything else becomes very clumsy. So elegance is not simply what you wear, but it's the way you are, even at home, when nobody is watching you. So if outrageousness is about going beyond the relative and towards the non-dual, elegance is all about working within the conventional, the worldly. It's working with the language and norms of society. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. It means learning to empathize and connect with and speak the language of our colleagues and also those who disagree with us, so that we can better build relationships and work together and get things done in the world. If we're just rebelling and fighting all the time, we're not going to have much in the way of skillful means. And likewise in our practice, elegance means not superimposing our own habits and ideas, but approaching situations with a genuine humility and openness, and a desire to tame ourselves and adapt ourselves to the situation. So both of these are very important. Elegance means we're able to work with others, to understand their needs and speak their language. And outrageousness means we're willing to do the right thing, irrespective of conventional consensus. So this idea of middle way, overcoming seeming opposites, there are many other examples, right? So for example, honesty and transparency as opposed to kindness. Right? A lot of us fear that if we're honest, it'll be unkind. Whereas others fear that the truth won't be spoken because people are too afraid and fearful of consequences for speaking honestly. And we have this debate in contemporary politics. Should we go for free speech or safe spaces and trigger warnings? Now for non-dual Buddhists, the answer is both, right? The choice as framed is a false choice. The right view is that honesty is the highest kindness, remember, in terms of outer, inner, and innermost, teaching the Dharma, teaching the truth. That's the best gift we can give. But of course, it's not useful to people if they can't absorb it. So we also need to create the psychological safety. We need to make it clear to the other person we have their interests at heart. We need to deliver whatever it is we say skillfully, without blame, taking full accountability ourselves. And interestingly, this is what the best organizational cultures do, right? They create high trust environments with high transparency and high openness, but founded on psychological safety and acceptance. So people feel comfortable speaking up without fear of criticism or reprisal. That's the same in therapy. A good therapist will create this environment of acceptance. They'll assume positive intent. They'll create psychological safety, but they'll foster transparency and disclosure and turning towards the truth. So the same can be true for us in our relationships and in our work. Another example would be accountability. We see this a lot with politics. More generally, when we see someone struggling in society, who should we hold accountable? Is it the individual's fault, or is it society's fault? Whose job is it to fix the problem, to find solutions? And again, left and right will have very different views on this. But for non-dual Buddhists, again, the answer is both, right? The choice as framed as a false choice. This also comes in relationships, right? Some free advice here. So many couples divide tasks in the relationships. You're responsible for cleaning the house, I'm responsible for mowing the lawn and keeping the garden clean. But this fosters a kind of mindset of separate accountabilities. So then when something doesn't work, we want to find whose fault is it. It ends up creating situations of blame, defensiveness, and so forth. Whereas happy and successful couples, they have a very different attitude, right? They don't try and divide it up and say, this is yours, this is mine. Rather, the attitude is 100-100 responsibility, right? Basically, each of us considers ourselves as being able to do something, as in some way responsible for what's happening. No matter what's happened, we in some way had some role. There's something we did or didn't do, something we said or didn't say. Right? This is a mindset of interdependence. You could say it's a very Buddhist mindset. So the question isn't who messed up. The question is, what could I have done? Right? And this is something both sides can do. So again, taking accountability, very much consistent with the Buddhist notion of karma, you are your own master, and at the same time with this notion of interdependence, right? Dependent arising. Another example, very common, you see the difference in parenting styles between the tiger mum, the classic Chinese model of a mum who pushes her kids, challenges them to be their best, is tough, is critical, but in the interests of really shaping the child up, versus the California mum who is kind and empathetic and supportive, where the children get medals just for showing up, even if they placed last. And I think for many of us, we tend to have a natural habit, perhaps because of our own childhood, for being comfortable with one of these and uncomfortable with the other. But the right answer, again, is both, right? It's a false choice. We need challenge and support. We need high standards and we need kindness. Right, the point of these examples is when we look at our own interactions in work and in relationships, we can observe our own habits and tendencies and preferences when it comes to our action, our conduct, and ask ourselves, where are we following the middle way, right, a non-dual view, and where are we just falling on one side? Right? Where do we have a strong preference about what is right and what is wrong? Where are we really able to do what is most beneficial versus just what we're comfortable with? Because if your only tool is a hammer, then indeed it looks like the world is full of nails. Okay, clearly, if we're going to interact in the world, having a practice of morality and ethics is very important. But what about wisdom, right? Is there a way we can get better at doing good, at being good, right? What's the link between wisdom and compassion and ethics? So I don't mean necessarily just in the non-dual sense, I mean in the practical worldly sense of wisdom, in terms of understanding dependent arising, understanding causality, understanding interdependence and cause and effect. And this is important in terms of how much should we follow the conventional consensus, or indeed even knowing what is the convention. And partly this is because in the Madhyamaka philosophy, for example, in Chandrakirti's texts, he's known as a Madhyamaka philosopher who accepts the conventional truth. The Tibetans are Jigten Drekta Chipa, right? He accepts the consensus of ordinary people. As Rinpoche said, he's saying that even though these decisions, these fabrications, they don't really make any ultimate sense, there's no point arguing with them because relative truth, it's all like an illusion in any case. So much more straightforward just to go along with what others think and then try to lead them to enlightenment using their conventional truth. But should we always do this, right? What if ordinary people disagree with each other? What if left and right have no shared consensus? What if we disagree with the consensus? What if people don't care enough about global warming or other things we might care a lot about? How might we apply wisdom? Right? More generally, how might we get better at doing good? So there's actually many models and ways of thinking about this, but I just want to introduce one that I think could be helpful. And this is from the psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg. He adapted a theory originally conceived by the Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget and started as a graduate student in the University of Chicago in the late 50s, but really built it throughout his life and is now very well known for this and gave birth to a whole new really domain of psychology. And it's all about moral reasoning, right? Because, of course, we can't really engage in ethical or moral behavior without reasoning that decides what we should do. And Kohlberg found that there are 6 developmental stages, each of which is more sophisticated and more adequate to responding to moral dilemmas than its predecessor, right? So they occur in phases of pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional morality. And he studied them using dilemmas. One in particular is called the Heinz dilemma, which I'm going to read it to you right now. And the point with this dilemma is not so much to say whether you would agree or disagree, but to notice what reasoning would you apply. Right, so here's the dilemma. There's a woman on her deathbed, and there's one drug that the doctors thought might save her. Right? It's a form of radium that a pharmacist in the same town had recently discovered. The drug's very expensive to make, but the pharmacist was charging 10 times what the drug cost him to produce. He paid $200 for the radium and was charging $2,000 for a small dose of the drug. The sick woman's husband, Heinz, after whom this is named, went to everyone he knew to borrow money, but he could only get together about $1,000, which is half of what it cost. He told the pharmacist that his wife was dying and asked him to sell it cheaper or let him pay later, but the pharmacist said, "No, I discovered the drug and I'm going to make money from it." So Heinz got desperate and broke into the man's laboratory to steal the drug for his wife. Okay, so this is the question. Should Heinz have broken into the laboratory to steal the drug for his wife? Why or why not? So, as I said, it's not as important what you think Heinz should do. It's more important of the justification that you offer. So let me just give you a moment just to make a note for yourself. What do you think your answer would be? And what is your reasoning? Or maybe just really write it down somewhere so you can commit to it. So here Kohlberg would say, well, a pre-conventional level of moral reasoning is what you typically see in children. In fact, they even suggest you see it in some animals, although adults, of course, will often resort to this also. And this is where you judge the morality of an action by its direct consequences. You're solely concerned with the self in an egocentric manner. This question of what's in it for me. For example, you might say that the man should steal the drug because, of course, he'll be happier if he saves his wife, even as he has to serve a prison sentence. So we're judging it in terms of his personal feelings or trade-offs or payoffs. Okay, next, the conventional level, more typical of adolescents and adults. And here the reasoning is to judge morality by comparing them to what society has in terms of views and expectations concerning right and wrong. And at this level, an individual will obey the rules and follow society norms, even when there are no consequences for obedience or disobedience. That's sort of waiting at a traffic light even in a dead of night when there's no cars. All right. This adherence to rules and conventions is somewhat rigid, however, and a rule's appropriateness or fairness may not be questioned. And most active members of society, right, most adults, they stay at stage 4, even though there are 2 more stages, where their morality is still predominantly dictated by an outside force. Right? So what would a level 4 be? For example, he might say, well, I should steal because my wife will benefit, but of course I will take the prescribed punishment for the crime, and I will pay the pharmacist what he is owed. Because I believe that criminals cannot just run around without regard for the law. Actions have consequences. Okay, post-conventional is also known as principled, and that's marked by a growing realization that individuals are separate from society, and an individual's perspective may take precedent over society's view. Individuals may disobey rules inconsistent with their own principles. A post-conventional moralist will live by their own ethical principles, which might include basic human rights like life or liberty or justice. And if you have post-conventional morality, you'll typically view rules as useful but changeable. Yeah, they're there to help society function well and protect human rights. They're not absolute dictates to be obeyed without question. Laws are valid only insofar as they are grounded in justice, and a commitment to justice carries with it an obligation to disobey unjust laws. Okay, so level 5 is a social contract orientation. So for example, here the husband might decide to steal the drug because he says everyone has a right to choose life, regardless of the law. Right, and level 6 is universal human ethics, where saving a human life is a more fundamental value than the property rights of another person. And because a post-conventional individual can elevate their own moral evaluation over a social convention, it can be easy to confuse post-conventional with pre-conventional. Yeah? Are you breaking the law just because it suits your self-interest? Or are you breaking the law for a principled reason where you don't agree with the way the law has been framed? So, I say all of this just again as we reflect about our Buddhist ethics. A lot of the Theravada ethics tend to be framed in more conventional terms, but the Mahayana is much more post-conventional, right? You are invited and encouraged to think of ethics, to think of compassion in terms of your wisest assessment of what is going to be of greatest benefit to all beings. So hopefully we can understand why cultivation of wisdom, even in a practical worldly sense, is relevant to cultivating our skillful means as a bodhisattva. And I also like this example as a way of bringing a rich practical wisdom and skillful means from Western philosophy and psychology and coaching onto the Buddhist path. And I think right now a lot of Western traditions like psychology are using, and some would say appropriating, Buddhist methods for their own ends, right? We're seeing mindfulness and self-compassion being used for therapeutic or stress release purposes and so forth. But I think as Buddhists, we can do the same, right? We can use non-Buddhist means. We can appropriate, if we wish. We can repurpose them for Buddhist ends. And this has a long and noble history, right? The Indo-Tibetan Buddhists absorbed and repurposed non-Buddhist tantric practices. Buddhism in China mingled with and borrowed and absorbed Taoist methods as it evolved into Chan and then Zen Buddhism. Actually, I wonder if the future of Western Buddhism isn't so much about a denatured secular practice, but rather about incorporating the rich, skillful means of Western psychology, adult development, coaching, and leadership as methods to help make our conduct as fine as flour. Okay, so with that, let's take our break. I will be back and see you in 10 minutes. Welcome back. So continuing, show the outline once again. We're going to talk a little bit about life as path and then about how to cultivate integrity. So when we say life as a path, I guess just to remind ourselves, a path for what? So it comes back to self-transformation and self-transcendence. So let me give the example of if I'm having a fight with my partner. In the relative truth, when we say the action is fine as flour, that's a chance for me to practice self-transformation. Now, I can use this experience to become a better person in a worldly sense, to build good habits, skillful means. I can practice doing no harm, being non-reactive, developing patience, not criticizing, not raising my voice, not attacking. I can practice doing good. I can practice kindness, finding a win-win, seeking to understand my own part in creating the problem, building trust, creating psychological safety, appreciating the other person. I can train my mind. I can develop a more sophisticated understanding of what it means to do good. I can think more about interdependency, the consequences of my actions, how I can be of benefit. I can develop insight. I can cultivate vipassana. And so all of these things are possible as part of my relative practice with a conflict. But likewise, I can also practice view vast as the sky, right? And this would be in service of self-transcendence, right? Realizing the illusory nature of all phenomena, including the self, to therefore completely overcome clinging to self, clinging to phenomena. Right? In the Mahayana, going beyond subject or object or action, relinquishing all points of attachment. So we start typically with the practice of seeing the perceived object as not real, right? Being like a dream or like an illusion. In the Theravada, we talk about them being a transitory collection. In the Mahayana, we see them as dreams, as illusions. In the Vajrayana, we see all deity as three kayas. And then we work back. Once we've seen the object as not truly existing, we see, therefore, the subject, the self that perceives, likewise is not real. Right? And this, then, is the vipassana practice we've talked about in the past, seeing the truth. We can do this anywhere, anytime. And also we practice the shamatha, right? The non-distraction, the turning towards. And so what result, then, do we accomplish? Remember we talked at the beginning about being in the world, but not of the world. So let me just say a little more about this. So this distinction between in the world versus not in the world really is all about our ability, our skillful means to get things done, to have an impact in the world. Can we be effective? Can we communicate? Can we relate to people? Can we fit in? Can we influence? Are we able to be of benefit? Do we have skillful means, right? The practical skill and ability to do things to benefit people in the world. So this is very much about compassion, the domain of relative truth. Whereas when we say whether we are of the world or not of the world, that's all about attachment as opposed to wisdom. Am I attached, subservient to, captured by worldly values and opinions, by the 8 worldly dharmas? Am I addicted to worldly things, social media, the need to look good and fit in? Do I lust after money or power or fame? Do I define myself by worldly values, whether for or against, or am I not attached and have gone beyond? And so if you can visualize having these as a sort of a matrix, a 2 by 2, we start with someone who is not really particularly skilled at being in the world, but they're very much of the world. Right? That's, I suppose, the worst case, where you're addicted to samsara, but you don't really have much mastery over your life. You're not really contributing or making society better. You're probably not even able to make your own life work particularly well. And of course, that's the unfortunate situation of many people. Now, the next one will be, you're still of the world, but now you're truly in the world, right? So this will be somebody who's successful, maybe a CEO or a politician or an activist or an artist or an athlete, even just an ordinary worldly person leading an ordinary and happy life, right? They found a way of making things work in the world, but they haven't yet thought about going beyond the world. So let's now move to the not of the world. Well, I guess the first place most of us would start is thinking that we're neither in the world nor of the world, and that's the classic renunciant, right? Leaving worldly things behind. A renunciant, a hermit, a monk, a nun, a wanderer, someone who doesn't care for worldly things, doesn't want to have an impact in the world. Unfortunately, the bad version of that is someone who could be a nihilistic dropout, someone antisocial or uncaring who simply doesn't care about worldly values, right? And then the final of the four quadrants would be somebody who's, as we said, the ideal is somebody who's in the world but not of the world. So this would be a Dharma king like Ashoka, a great bodhisattva, or even just an ordinary householder who's aiming to live according to Dharma. Right? Somebody who understands the importance of benefiting others in this illusory world, but who is not attached or stuck within the world, right? Gone beyond the world, but still very much in the world. And I think sometimes people assume there's a trade-off between Dharma and living a happy or successful worldly life. And yeah, maybe in the Theravada where there is more of a boundary, where the tradition is more monastic, but definitely not in the Mahayana. And I would say, I suppose that's also what differentiates more of a self-help path from a Dharma path, because in self-help, yes, we want to get better at being in the world, but there's no interest in being not of the world. Dharma, our first, is always going to be to go from being of the world to being not of the world. So if we've got limited time, limited energy, we're not necessarily going to invest first in becoming more successful in a worldly sense. We're going to invest first in becoming less attached. Now, so I think as usual, just always check for yourself, what is your purpose? Are you using your Buddhist path to solve worldly problems or genuinely to cultivate non-attachment? And I think Rinpoche is often asked, how should I balance the needs of my Dharma path, my Dharma practice with worldly life? And of course he will say you should focus on the path of wisdom and compassion, on your Dharma path, but he will still say, do a kind of 80-20 with samsara, right? Make sure you put in place the basics when it comes to money, health, and relationships. Don't allow it to become a problem, but at the same time, don't get obsessed. Because for most of us, we can certainly take care of the basics and still have a lot of time left over to then practice Dharma. I think the problem becomes when we're no longer satisfied with just the basics and we decide we somehow need to push for more money or some idea of optimal, impossible to attain health and so forth, right? It's possible to get very obsessive about samsara in a way that leaves no time left over to practice Dharma. So just check for yourself, where are you in that balance? And I think the words, not of this world, I think it probably applies to most spiritual paths. And it's suggesting there's a way of living that's beyond ordinary worldly values. And actually, I was just reading, and the phrase comes up a lot in the Bible as well. I'll just give you a couple of examples. So in the Epistle to the Romans 12:2, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God and what is good and acceptable and perfect. In the first Epistle of John, 18:36, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting and I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world. Also, first Epistle of John, so 15:19. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. The final one, first Epistle of John again, 2:15 to 2:17. Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and pride in possessions, is not from the Father, but is from the world, and the world is passing away along with its desires, but whoever does the will of God abides forever. Now, I think this is important context, right? As we saw in week 6, Abrahamic attitudes very much the underpinning of Western thought, right? Western philosophical and legal systems, and therefore the modern world in general. But Buddhism, I think, is quite different from Christianity in thinking about the meaning of not of this world. Because although they're both not of this world, they're very different in the way they accomplish it. Because in Christianity, it's very much about obeying God. Right? It's not about seeking to realize the truth of the three marks of non-duality. It's very much a dualistic path. And also in Christianity, the kingdom of God and the world are opposed. Right? You can't have both. As the quote said, if you're not of the world hates you, right? Essentially, if you're not of the world, you can't be in the world. So Christianity has a very dualistic attitude, whereas Buddhism really is non-dual. And so I do think part of the challenge many of us have in integrating Dharma into everyday life is a little bit this confusion about whether we should, this background noise, so to speak, of a Christian ethical framework that we use. We have an underlying suspicion that we can actually be in the world. Or in Buddhism, we might have a bit of a leftover idea that samsara and nirvana are different places or different realms rather than just different attitudes of mind. Right? But this is not the case. We can be both in the world and not of the world. We can, and indeed we should, practice both the relative and the ultimate. Okay, so when we talk about a path then, what makes something a path? And Buddhism's an unusual path because it takes you back to where you started. In fact, you never left. Right? You're not in a different place or a different country. Nirvana isn't some heavenly realm up in the clouds somewhere. What has changed is your view, your intention, your attitude, your way of being. Now, you're in the world. Ideally, you're making a positive contribution to making the world a better place. Right? You care about your relationships. You care about your work. But you're not of the world. You're not caught in the eight worldly dharmas. You're not worried about looking good or what people are thinking about you. You're not focused on how many likes you're getting for your posts on social media. Right? You're not attached. Of course, the challenge is how can we get enough space from our lives to be able to practice and then accomplish this changed view and this changed way of being? Because if we never leave our ordinary lives, how are we ever going to practice a different way of being? Of course, it's wonderful to go on retreat. It's great to have a corner of your home that's somehow separate and sacred, that's devoted to your Buddhist practice. And it's great to have a time in the day, however brief, when you're focused on your Dharma practice or study, you're familiarizing yourself with the view, cultivating skillful means. But if you're an ordinary householder with a family, with a job, it can be hard to carve out the time. And so the great innovation of Mahayana Buddhism is to use everyday life as a path, right? To use your work, to use your relationships as an opportunity to practice. So we've already talked about the practice of not doing harm, cultivating loving kindness and compassion, avoiding harmful speech like harsh speech and divisive speech. And you can do this with everyone in your life. And not only will it help in your worldly relationships, but it is a wonderful Dharma practice, right? Remember, do the good, the beginning, the middle, the end. And there's no doubt that if you really do this, even these practices in your normal relationships and workplace will transform your mind. Okay, so what else can we do then to make our everyday life into a path? Well, first, I think really to see it as a field of practice. It's hard to practice piano without an instrument. It's hard to cook if you don't have ingredients or a fire or a pan. And so we can, of course, practice wisdom and compassion and mindfulness in the solitary confines of our mountain retreat, but it's very helpful to practice in the world. And the world gives you a constant stream of threats, challenges, conflicts, opportunities, distractions, seductions. Yeah, and having the opportunity to see how am I going to deal with them. Having an actual group of people you want to benefit, with whom you want to practice loving kindness and compassion and generosity and patience. Ask yourself, what is it like for them? What is it like for me when I'm trying to practice with them? I think a second important idea is the idea of a container or a boundary. Because, yes, we can use each day the people we meet and interact with as our path, but we know that we have tremendous capacity for self-deception. So it's important to build a container and take accountability and not make excuses. We want to contain the energy from our practice, right? All the struggles, the thoughts and emotions that come up, and transform them onto the path rather than get caught up with them. Because if you let it, ego will find a hiding place. So in chemistry, you have this idea of a crucible. Right? It's a ceramic or metal container in which you can melt metals or other substances and withstands temperatures high enough to melt or otherwise alter the contents. And the alchemists of the old days used to see the inner alchemy of transforming our being as following an analogous process, right? Just like the outer transformation of a metal. Similarly, we need a container for our inner transformation. And Rinpoche, likewise, he will talk a lot about the importance of building a strong container for our practice. Indeed, for those of you practicing Vajrayana in sadhana, there's a lovely section of the practice where you actually visualize and build a container. It's called the Vajra tent, right? So, but this idea, how can we ensure that when we're practicing, we're just practicing, right? We're not getting caught up in distraction. I mean, I know many people who, when they practice, they realize, wow, it makes me very creative. And some people even put a notebook beside their practice area so that they can jot down creative ideas when they come up in practice. But I'd suggest not doing that, right? I'd suggest not having a notebook, no matter how creative the idea is, because before you know it, your practice will become a creative ideation session, not a Dharma practice. Yeah? And so forth, right? Keep to your practice commitments, keep to your sessions. Don't allow it to sort of be spreading into or influenced by your worldly life. Otherwise, the container is loose. You'll lose the benefit. And likewise, making commitments to the people in your work, in your life, gives you an opportunity to test yourself. Right? You interact with them a lot, so there's a lot of opportunities for practice. And actually, Rinpoche will often say that's one of the advantages of doing a group three-year retreat rather than a solitary one. I mean, you might think, if you haven't done it, that a three-year retreat is all around advanced Vajrayana practices, which indeed it is. But many retreatants find their most profound learning is just about the basics of living together. Yeah? So always remember, in Buddhism, our practice is not about escaping from the world, but about being in the world and yet not of the world. I think a third really important way of thinking about path is mirror. Right? The path can and should be a mirror to you. It gives you feedback. It reflects back your habits and your behaviors. It's like a readout of who you are being in the world, what you want, what you're putting out into a space, what you're blind to. And that's why really committing to something creates the best practice environment. If you just sit in an ivory tower and philosophize, you're not getting any feedback from real life. It's very easy to fall into self-deception. Yeah, and notice that when we treat people and phenomena in our lives as a mirror, it's very different from treating them as ordinary people or ordinary objects. Because when we treat someone or something as a mirror, we're explicitly acknowledging that all our experiences and projections are conditioned by our own thoughts, our own emotions, including whatever dirt is on our window. The world we experience is, in a very real sense, our own minds being reflected back towards us. Our own minds being shown to us. So if we practice with that spirit of the world as mirror, if we see the people and objects in our world, good or bad, desirable or undesirable, beautiful or ugly, and realize all of that is just actually showing to us our own projections. I want to just touch briefly also on the Buddha's life story and the way he saw the middle way, because I think that also is very relevant for thinking about how we approach work and relationships. So in the early texts, it's told of how Gautama practiced under two teachers of yogic meditation. Yeah, he first studied with Arada Kalama, who taught a meditation attainment called the sphere of nothingness. And he was asked by Arada to become an equal leader of their spiritual community. But Gautama felt unsatisfied by the practice because he felt it didn't lead to revulsion, dispassion, cessation, calm, knowledge, awakening. It didn't lead to nirvana. Right? Very similar, by the way, to the critique we might make of contemporary mindfulness, right? It leads to a stillness, perhaps, but not a wisdom, not an awakening. So the Buddha moved on to become a student of Udraka Ramaputra, and with him he achieved high levels of meditative consciousness called the sphere of neither perception nor non-perception. Again, was asked to join his teacher, but once more he was not satisfied for the same reasons, and he moved on. Now, after leaving these teachers, he then practiced ascetic techniques, right? Very minimal food intake, different forms of breath control, forceful mind control. The texts report he became so emaciated that his bones became visible beneath his skin. But at a certain point, he realized this was not the way, right? He realized the right path to awakening was the meditative dhyana, right? And he discovered the middle way, a path of moderation away from extremes of either self-indulgence or self-mortification. He broke with asceticism, and it said that his 5 companions then abandoned him as they believed he'd abandoned his search and become undisciplined. There's a popular story of how he accepted milk and rice pudding from a village girl named Sujata. And then once he decided to stop these extreme ascetic practices, he sat and determined not to rise until fully awakened. And this, of course, was under the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya. So I think the point of this story, the story of the middle way, is that it's not about moderation. As we've said in previous weeks, non-duality is about not falling into extremes. Yeah. So same in our conduct, our action, our life, right? We still need to act. So always understanding where are we potentially falling into extremes, right? Even the idea of moderation can be an extreme. I think Oscar Wilde had the lovely quote, "Everything in moderation, including moderation." And when the Buddha taught his first teaching, the setting of the wheel and Dharma in motion, Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, he said, what are these 2 extremes not to be indulged in? That is, being devoted to sensual pleasure with reference to sensual objects, base, vulgar, common, ignoble, unprofitable, and that which is devoted to self-affliction, painful, ignoble, unprofitable. Avoiding both of these extremes, the middle way realized by the Tathagata, producing vision, producing knowledge, leads to calm, to direct knowledge, to self-awakening, to unbinding. And what is this middle way? It is precisely this Noble Eightfold Path. Right view, right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. So I think, this relationship to the body, it comes up a lot in spiritual teachings of all kinds. And I think it's highly symbolic, highly central. Of course, we all have a body. And not just these Indian sects practiced asceticism. Ideas of self-affliction, self-mortification are throughout Christianity also. Wearing sackcloth, wearing hair shirts. The idea that self is a problem. Yeah? The problem is, if you think that way, it makes the self into something real. Whereas in Buddhism, we don't see the self as real. We don't see it as a problem. The self is an illusion. It's not a real problem. And so selflessness is not about being against the world. It's about going beyond the world. Of course, it's not indulging either. I think the challenge for many of us is that to go to this place of beyond, we first have to go against our current habits, because we have very strong habits of being in the world, of being indulgent towards the self. So there probably does need to be a little bit of rebalancing, maybe pushing the pendulum a little bit to the other side before we can go beyond both sides. But just always to remember, our job is not to be stuck in the world. It is not to be against the world. It's to go beyond the world. And then, of course, as bodhisattvas, we want to help others within the world. I want to turn a little bit now to this idea of integrity. I think it's another very practical way we can make all this very concrete. It really comes down again to making vows, making commitments, which is a big feature of the Buddhist path as well. So what is integrity? Well, the dictionary says it's the quality of being honest and having strong moral principles and moral uprightness. Right? It's showing a consistent and uncompromising adherence to strong moral and ethical principles and values. It's often regarded as the honesty and truthfulness or accuracy of one's actions, as opposed to hypocrisy. Right? Standards of integrity involve regarding internal consistency as a virtue. So if you find yourself with apparently conflicting values, you account for the discrepancy. Right? It comes from the Latin adjective integer, meaning whole or complete. Right? So in this context, it's this inner sense of wholeness deriving from qualities such as honesty and consistency of character. As such, you may judge that yourself or others have integrity to the extent that you act according to values, beliefs, and principles you claim to hold. Right? It goes back to what we talked about earlier with this idea of self-deception, how we lie to ourselves, and obviously that's a very fundamental breakage of integrity. And Aristotle said in the Nicomachean Ethics that rulers and leaders have particular challenges because they have power, and so they're tempted to use it for personal gain. And so for anyone who wishes to serve others, to serve society, it's very important that they have integrity. Right? Doesn't mean they necessarily act according to the good, because in any case, who knows what is good? We can disagree about what is good, but it is important for somebody to act consistently and in accordance with their stated values. Right? And I think the same is true for all of us. Right? We may not have the power of great CEOs or politicians, but we all have some power, and we're all tempted to use it for personal gain. So I think, likewise, integrity is critical in our own lives and relationships. Now, in general, we take vows on the Buddhist path, a refuge vow, a bodhisattva vow. If you're in the Vajrayana, you will take a tantric vows and samayas. But we can also use the practice of relationships or work as a path in a way of making commitments and agreements, right? So not kind of vague, I'll try to do this, the kind of New Year's resolutions that never happen, but actual commitments that are realistic. As Rinpoche says, it's far better to commit to doing 1 minute's practice a day, but actually keep it, and then maybe after a month increase it to 2 minutes a day, much better than this grandiose idea of, I'm going to do 30 minutes or an hour or 2 hours every day, but then not do it. Because before long, you'll start giving up, you'll start feeling guilty, you'll start developing the self-narrative of being someone who isn't true to their word, someone who lacks integrity. Yeah? You're developing, essentially, a habit of lacking integrity. You recall in Hamlet, Act 1, Scene 3, where Polonius says, "This above all, to thine own self be true, and it must follow, as the night the day. Thou canst not then be false to any man." So, what might integrity mean for us? Well, I think at a small scale level, it's about following your word and your commitment rather than about looking good, rather than falling prey to the 8 worldly dharmas. It's also Kohlberg's point about moral reasoning, where we'll often break our word just out of sheer convenience. But I think also there's a macro version, which comes down to our life design, right? Have we committed to do something useful with our precious time on earth? I mean, to be congruent, to have integrity, we need to have some values. I mean, if you can imagine like a company or even a non-profit without a mission, a vision, or values, very quickly you would lose confidence in the leadership. The board of directors would probably vote them down and want to get some new leaders. And yet, our own lives, even more important, one might think, we very rarely think through what might our own mission or vision or values be. We don't have a board of directors to keep us accountable, and we know how prone we are to self-deception. We make excuses all the time, right? We lie, we cheat to ourselves. So this isn't going to be easy. And I think also we have associations that accountability means being tough. And yet, here we are, saying this is the very thing we'd like from our lives, and yet the only person who's letting ourselves down is ourselves. As Rinpoche said, you want to lose weight, you want to become a ballerina, you do what it takes. I mean, if it's tough, if your feet bleed, so be it, right? Of course, we have no objection to methods that are easy or quick or painless, as long as they actually get the results we want. The problem is we'll so often trade off something easy and quick and painless and not do what it is that's necessary to get our results. And so we end up with a life that's wasted, right? A purpose, a possibility that's unfulfilled. So I think it's also important to take our vows seriously. Our refuge vow, our bodhisattva vow, but even maybe make some sort of vow to ourselves about what we want to do with our lives. I think we need to define for ourselves, what does the Buddhist path mean for us? I mean, the easy part is done, right? If we take the bodhisattva vow, we've already said we wish to benefit all beings, not just in a worldly sense, but ideally bring them all to the state of awakening. I guess the harder question is, how are we going to bring our own individual skills and gifts and unique capacities, our interests and our passions, how are we going to bring them to bear to where we see a real need and a real opportunity to make a difference? But I think it's important for us to ask ourselves that question, and actually come up with some plan for how do we wish to show up in our relationship, in our work, with this sort of intentionality. Because we're all going to break our vows all the time, but at least let's make some. At least let's commit to something. So let me just talk a little about what do we do when we break a vow? And again, very interesting, because I find even here the Buddhist idea of confession is quite similar to a Christian idea, of course with some very big differences. But let's just look at the Christian idea first. The doctrine of repentance, as taught in the Bible, is a call to persons to make a radical turn from one way of life to another. Repentance, also metanoia, that's called for throughout the Bible, is a summons to a personal, absolute, and ultimate unconditional surrender to God as sovereign. Though it includes sorrow and regret, it's much more than that. It's a call to conversion, from self-love, self-trust, and self-assertion to obedient trust and self-commitment to now live for God and His purposes. Repentance typically requires an admission of guilt for committing a wrong or omitting to do the right thing, a promise or resolve not to repeat the offence, an attempt to make restitution for the wrong or in some way to reverse the harmful effects of the wrong or the omission where possible. So this is, about taking personal accountability. It's about acknowledging where we fall short, where we've done wrong. It's about having, as we said right at the beginning, a distinction between the right path and the wrong path, and therefore some ethical understanding of right and wrong, good and bad. So we need, as we said at the beginning, a definition of what is good. And we've already said, in Buddhism, it's about realizing the truth, following the middle way, whereas in Abrahamic religions, it's about obeying and pleasing God. Now, while in the Theravada, the monk's vow is usually considered unfixable once broken, in the Mahayana and the Vajrayana, we can repair broken vows through confession. And it's interesting, again, how similar this is to a Christian notion of repentance. So, for example, in the Vajrayana, there's a practice of Vajrasattva, which has 4 powers, right, as part of the practice. And the first one is the power of support, right? It's provided by taking refuge in Vajrasattva. Now, it could be Vajrasattva, but Vajrasattva, remember, is none other than the Buddha, none other than the nature of your own mind, right? And the support then is cultivating bodhicitta with Vajrasattva as the witness. It could be a teacher, it could be a representation of the body, speech, and mind of the Buddhas. You can confess in terms of anyone or anything that you find meaningful. But the idea of relationship is very powerful because it calls upon our natural emotional habits, right, as a way of keeping ourselves honest. Regret, the power of regret is a feeling of remorse for all the negative actions you've done in the past. There can be no purification if you don't see your misdeeds as being wrong. Resolution, power of resolution is to remember the faults you've committed and resolve not to commit them again. And then action as an antidote. And this power is about accomplishing as many positive actions as you can as an antidote to past negative actions, which is then engaging in the practice of the Bodhisattva path. So The support, the container, right? This is where we see the biggest difference, because in Christianity, of course, the notion of truth and the notion of the container are quite different. But the other three elements, the regret, the resolution, and the action, are very similar. Yeah? So the difference is the object of refuge, right? Here, Vajrasattva, Buddha, nature of mind. In other words, as we said, you are your own master. It's not someone external. It really is about living with integrity, right? Hence we keep coming back to integrity. It's not about obeying external rules. Right? In Buddhism, ethics are always about working with your own mind, your own projection. And the rule itself is not God's word, right? There's nothing fixed or determined and then interpreted by a lineage of priests. And there's nothing in Buddhism which will say, oh, we have rules that homosexuality or gay marriage are good or bad. Rather, it's wisdom, compassion, mindfulness, and that is always contemporary because it's always to be interpreted in accordance with the times and the needs. Right? What worked in the Buddha's era, 2,500 years ago, is going to be very different from what is needed today. But wisdom isn't about fixed rules, right? Compassion isn't about fixed rules. It's about what is good and wise for now. I'll tell a brief story from the words of my perfect teacher. So one day a meditator, a disciple of the Peerless Dagpo Rinpoche, told his teacher that he felt regret when he remembered he'd once made his living from the sale of sacred books. Print books then, the master told him. So he set to work, but he found that his work got him involved in many distractions. Disillusioned, he went back to see his teacher. Printing these texts brings up too many distractions, he said. Is it not true that no method of confession is more profound than remaining in the essential nature? Dagpo Rinpoche was delighted and told him he was perfectly right. Even if you have committed negative actions as colossal as Mount Meru itself, they are purified in one instant of seeing the nature. There is indeed no deeper way to cleanse oneself of past misdeeds than to meditate on bodhicitta and to maintain the flow of the unaltered natural state. Keep these two things in mind as you go through the details of your meditation. So, of course, we're ripe for self-delusion here, but this idea we've talked about before, just noticing, just being aware of what is happening right now, if you can do that, if you can actually do that, that is the best purification and confession. But of course, we should still do all the outer worldly things as well. You know, always have the horse and the donkey together so that if you fall off your horse, you'll still have the donkey to ride. The point is, you can do this practice of making commitments to the people in your lives, in relationships, in work, to yourself. And you can confess if you make them, if you break them, right? So this can become part of your practice. You can use Vajrasattva if you know that practice, but if not, just this notion of really having the regret, the resolution, and engaging in positive actions, that will be helpful and useful no matter what. And in terms of life design, right, Rinpoche has talked a lot about not just following societal views of how you should live. So when we talk about committing to something, your own set of mission, vision, values, and so forth, Rinpoche used the word creativity. Right? I've used the word self-authorship. You don't have to fall prey to conventional values, especially since, as Rinpoche so often said, in the coming age of artificial intelligence, jobs are going to change so completely. This idea of dignity coming from our work is not something we're going to be able to turn to in the future. But also don't be naive about money, right? Don't become a burden on others. I mean, in one of his teachings, Rinpoche said, maybe we should all consider becoming plumbers or electricians, right? Jobs which are not about status, not about identity, not about the 8 worldly dharmas, but something practical, something that leaves time for yourself. Yeah, maybe for fun, even better for practice. How to choose what to do if it's all empty? Well, you know, the choice is never ending, right? We've already said, yes, combine your strengths, your passions, the opportunities you see, but continue to do your practice. The more you increase your wisdom, the more you increase your compassion, the more you increase your mindfulness, the more it will become apparent what the right thing to do is. Yeah, as Kohlberg pointed out, our moral sense is something that can be and will be cultivated through our practice. So it's not just knowing what to do, but having the ability to do it. And especially in the current world, so much of what is needed in the workplace is emotional intelligence skills, how to influence others without power and authority, how to communicate, how to coach, how to think clearly, being self-aware about one's own blind spots and assumptions. So even in a relative sense, Dharma can really help tremendously with all of this. And I think, as we said a lot today, always focus first on doing no harm. Right, Rinpoche, he often refers to the Tibetan saying, don't burn other people's noses. Or as Milarepa said, don't deceive yourself, don't disturb others. And all the while, don't forget that your view should be as vast as the sky. So as we come to the end then of our time together, I just want to leave you with a couple of thoughts. Firstly, just Rinpoche said, ultimately we should refute all views, relatively accept everything without analysis, and conventionally do your practice. And as we think about our practice, I love some words from Lao Tzu. He said, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. The first step leads to the second to the third, and soon the beauty of the countryside makes you forget the toil of the road. My favorite Dudjom Rinpoche quote, where he said, Buddhahood is not attained by fabricated dharmas. Meditation made by the mind, fabricated by the intellect, is the deceiving enemy. Now clinging to style and manner is destroyed with crazy abandon. Let this life be spent in the state of uninhibited naked ease. And that's very much something I wish for all of you. And as we said, good in the beginning, good in the middle, good in the end. So let's close with the dedication prayer. This is one Rinpoche loves to use from Shantideva's Bodhicharyavatara. And now, as long as space endures, as long as there are beings to be found, may I continue likewise to remain, to drive away the sorrows of the world. So with that, I thank you all. I'm going to, at some point over the coming weeks, do an additional week 0 teaching as an even more foundational introduction for beginners. But until then, I wish you all the best. Thank you for joining, and I look forward to seeing you again in future teachings. Goodbye.